The forests of the New World whispered secrets that European minds weren't prepared to accept. When German explorers first carved their paths through the dense wilderness of colonial America, they carried with them certainties about what was real and what belonged to folklore. Those certainties wouldn't survive the journey. Something waited in the shadows between the trees, something that moved with an intelligence that no animal should possess, something that left tracks in the morning frost that started as human feet and ended as the paws of wolves. The year 1723 marked the beginning of accounts that would haunt German exploration records for the next century, though most of these documents were quietly buried in archives that few people knew existed. What makes these stories different from the werewolf legends of the old world is the sheer number of witnesses, the consistency of their descriptions, and the fact that many of these men were trained naturalists who had documented dozens of new species with meticulous accuracy. When they wrote about the creatures that stalked them through American forests, they used the same careful language they employed for everything else. They weren't telling campfire stories. They were filing reports. Hans Muller was the first to put ink to paper about what his expedition encountered in the Pennsylvania wilderness. A cartographer by trade and a member of the Moravian Church, Muller had joined a group of German settlers pushing west from Philadelphia into territories that existing maps labeled simply as unknown. His journal entry from September 17th, 1723 describes an animal that followed his party for 3 consecutive nights. At first, they assumed it was a wolf, perhaps curious about their campfires or the smell of their provisions. Wolves were common enough, and while dangerous in packs, a single animal rarely posed a threat to a group of armed men. But this wolf behaved differently. Muller noted that it never approached close enough to be seen clearly, yet it seemed to move in response to their conversations, as though it understood their words. When they discussed changing their route in the morning, the creature circled to the direction they planned to travel. When they debated posting additional guards, it withdrew to exactly the distance a musket shot would lose accuracy. The men tried to dismiss these observations as coincidence, but Muller's training wouldn't allow him to ignore patterns. He had spent years mapping terrain by recognizing patterns that others missed. On the 3rd night, something happened that Muller struggled to describe even in the privacy of his own journal. One of the younger members of the expedition, a man named Friedrich Vogel, had wandered perhaps 30 yards from camp to relieve himself. The others heard him scream. Not in pain, but in what Muller described as pure terror, the kind of sound a man makes when he sees something his mind refuses to accept. They found Vogel frozen in place, his eyes locked on something in the darkness beyond their torchlight. He wouldn't speak, he wouldn't move. When they finally pulled him back to the fire, he spent the rest of the night staring into the flames, and when dawn came, he gathered his belongings and started walking back toward Philadelphia, without saying a word to anyone. Muller and the others discovered tracks where Vogel had been standing. The prints started as those of a large wolf, clear and deep in the soft earth, but 10 feet away, the tracks changed. They became longer, the toes spread differently, and the depth of the impression shifted as though the creature had risen onto its hind legs. The prints continued in this bipedal pattern for another 20 yards before returning to 4-legged wolf tracks. Muller sketched the prints in his journal, making careful measurements and notes. Years later, when that journal was discovered in a church archive in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, those sketches would be the first of many nearly identical drawings from different German explorers, separated by years and hundreds of miles, none of whom had met or compared notes. What Friedrich Vogel saw that night remained his secret. until he was an old man on his deathbed. His grandson later recounted the story his grandfather finally told, how he had watched a massive wolf rise up from all fours until it stood taller than any man, how its front legs had shifted and changed until they resembled arms more than paws, and how it had looked at him with eyes that held a human intelligence before dropping back to four legs and disappearing into the forest. The grandson said his grandfather wept while telling the story, not from fear, but from the weight of carrying it alone for so many decades. Mueller's expedition continued west without Vogel, but the strange encounters didn't stop. In fact, they intensified. The creature, or perhaps others like it, began leaving deliberate signs. Dead deer would be found, arranged in patterns near their camps, the carcasses positioned in ways that seemed intentional, rather than the random scatter of a kill site. Tree branches were broken at heights no wolf could reach, always directly above where the expedition planned to make camp. The men began to feel observed every moment they spent in the forest, a sensation that grew so oppressive, some of them developed what Mueller called a nervous fever, unable to sleep or eat properly. The reports from Mueller's expedition eventually reached other German communities along the eastern seaboard. And rather than dismissing them as the ravings of men driven mad by wilderness, these accounts were taken seriously. The Moravian Church had established several settlements in Pennsylvania, and their records contain references to similar encounters going back even earlier than 1723, though these earlier mentions are fragmentary and less detailed. What becomes clear when examining these documents collectively is that German settlers and explorers were experiencing something in the American forests that their English and Dutch neighbors either weren't encountering or weren't reporting. This pattern raises questions that make the phenomenon even more puzzling. Were the creatures specifically targeting German expeditions? Did something about German exploration techniques bring them into contact with these beings more frequently? Or were German settlers simply more willing to document experiences that others chose to forget? The answer might lie in the very different cultural attitudes toward the supernatural that Germans brought with them from Europe. Unlike their English counterparts, who increasingly viewed werewolf legends as peasant superstition, many Germans still held beliefs rooted in older traditions, beliefs that made them more likely to recognize and record encounters with the unexplainable. Jacob Hartmann's expedition of 1731 would provide what might be the most detailed account of an extended encounter with these creatures. Hartmann was leading a group of surveyors through the Appalachian foothills, mapping potential sites for new settlements. His expedition journal, preserved in the archives of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, reads like a descent into nightmare stretched across 6 weeks. The document is remarkable for its clinical tone, even as it describes events that should have been impossible. The expedition first noticed the wolves on their 4th day into the mountains. 3 animals, larger than typical wolves, followed them at a distance that remained constant, whether the party moved quickly or slowly. Hartmann noted their size and unusual gray-white coloring, but what caught his attention was their coordination. The 3 wolves maintained perfect spacing between each other, and they never broke formation even when traversing difficult terrain. He had hunted wolves in his youth, and he knew pack behavior. This wasn't pack behavior. This was something else entirely. By the 2nd week, the wolves had been joined by others until 7 animals shadowed the expedition. They no longer maintained their distance, but moved closer each night, forming a loose circle around the camp just beyond the firelight. Hartmann ordered his men to keep the fires burning continuously and to maintain constant watch. But the wolves showed no sign of aggression. They simply watched and waited. Several men reported hearing sounds from the forest that resembled human voices, speaking in German, though the words were never quite clear enough to understand. Hartmann dismissed these reports initially, attributing them to wind and imagination, but then he heard the voices himself. What he described in his journal was not the howling of wolves, but a low conversation taking place somewhere in the darkness. The cadence and rhythm distinctly human, even though he couldn't make out individual words. He noted that the sounds seemed to respond to activities in the camp. When men spoke loudly, the forest voices grew louder. When the camp fell silent, the voices faded to whispers. Hartman was educated enough to know about acoustic tricks that terrain could play with sound, but he also knew that what he was hearing couldn't be explained by echoes or wind through trees. These sounds had intention behind them. The situation changed dramatically on the 16th night. One of the surveyors, a young man named Klaus Becker, claimed to have seen one of the wolves stand upright near the edge of camp and gesture with its front leg before dropping back to all fours. The other men ridiculed him until 3 nights later, when Hartman himself witnessed the same behavior. He was making his rounds of the camp perimeter when he noticed one of the larger wolves sitting on its haunches, perhaps 20 feet away. As he watched, the animal slowly rose until it stood fully upright on its hind legs, remaining in this position for several seconds before lowering itself and walking away on all fours. Hartman's description of the creature's proportions while standing suggests it was well over 6 feet tall. That same night, the expedition made a discovery that Hartman initially chose not to record in the official journal, but later added in a personal notation dated months after their return. One of the men found tracks near the camp that clearly showed a transformation in progress. The prints began as those of wolves circling the camp, but in several locations, the tracks showed the animals had risen to 2 legs, walked a short distance upright, and then returned to 4-legged locomotion. More disturbing were prints that appeared to show hands rather than paws, with distinct finger marks in the soft earth. Hartman sketched these tracks, and his drawings match almost exactly the ones Muller had made 8 years earlier. Despite the 2 men being in different locations and having never communicated, the voices from the forest grew more frequent and more distinct. Multiple expedition members reported hearing their names called from the darkness in voices that sounded like friends or family members. Hartman recorded an incident where he clearly heard his wife's voice calling to him from the forest, speaking in her distinctive Bavarian dialect and using a pet name that no one else in the expedition would have known. The temptation to respond or investigate was overwhelming, but Hartman ordered his men never to answer the voices and never to leave the camp alone at night. Several men disobeyed this order and walked into the forest following the voices. All of them returned, but they returned changed. The first man to venture out came back after only a few minutes. He claimed to have walked no more than 50 yards when he encountered one of the wolves standing upright on a fallen log. The creature, he said, tilted its head and studied him with an expression that was disturbingly human before speaking a single word in clear German. The word was live. The man fled back to camp and refused to discuss what else he might have seen or heard. 2 other men who followed voices into the darkness returned with similar stories. Encounters with upright wolves that either spoke or made gestures that conveyed meaning. One man swore he saw a wolf transform partially into human form, its face becoming almost human while its body remained animal, before it retreated deeper into the forest. Hartman faced a decision that would determine whether his expedition survived. They could continue their survey work, pretending these encounters weren't happening, or they could acknowledge that something in these mountains wanted them gone and that continuing would likely end in disaster. His final journal entries from that expedition reveal a man torn between duty and survival. The maps they had produced were incomplete. The settlements, depending on their survey work, needed the information they had come to gather. But the wolves, if that's what they truly were, had made their intentions clear. This territory was claimed, and the German surveyors were trespassing. On the 28th night, the decision was made for them. The wolves attacked the camp, but their attack wasn't what anyone expected. They didn't charge in with teeth bared. Instead, they systematically destroyed the expedition's equipment and supplies. Men watched in disbelief as wolves worked together to overturn supply crates, tear apart tents, and scatter provisions into the forest. When expedition members tried to intervene, the wolves didn't attack them directly, but drove them back through coordinated movements that seemed almost military in their precision. The entire event lasted perhaps 10 minutes, and when it was over, the expedition had lost more than half their supplies and most of their surveying equipment. Hartman ordered an immediate retreat. The expedition limped back toward civilization over the next week, and during that entire journey, the wolves followed but made no further aggressive moves. They maintained a constant presence at the edge of visibility, and at night the voices continued their whispers from the darkness. But there were no more attacks, no more confrontations. It was as though the creatures were simply ensuring the humans left their territory and didn't return. On the day the expedition crossed back into settled lands, the wolves disappeared. Hartman noted in his journal that their absence was more unnerving than their presence had been, as though a weight had been lifted, but the memory of that weight would never fade. The official report Hartman filed with his sponsors made no mention of wolves or voices or any of the strange encounters. He cited difficult terrain, equipment failures, and illness among the men as reasons for the incomplete survey. But his personal journal told the real story, and that journal would circulate quietly among German communities for years, copied and passed along as a warning to those considering expeditions into certain territories. The Appalachian region Hartmann had attempted to survey remained largely unexplored by German settlers for another generation, and when they finally did establish settlements there, local folklore immediately developed around creatures in the mountains that walked like men, but were something else entirely. What makes Hartman's account particularly significant is what happened to several members of his expedition in the years that followed. Klaus Becker, the young surveyor who first reported seeing a wolf stand upright, became obsessed with returning to the mountains. He mounted 3 separate solo expeditions, despite warnings from Hartman and others. On his 3rd attempt, he disappeared completely. Search parties found his abandoned camp with all his supplies intact, but Becker himself was never seen again. 2 other expedition members reported persistent dreams of running through forests on all 4s, dreams so vivid they would wake up exhausted with dirt under their fingernails. Both men eventually moved away from frontier regions and refused to discuss their experiences. But here's what the official histories don't mention, what got carefully edited out of church records and government documents in the decades that followed. There were multiple reports of German settlers in Pennsylvania, encountering men who claimed to have been members of that expedition, but who behaved strangely and seemed to avoid other humans. These men were always seen at dusk or dawn, never in full daylight, and they invariably fled when approached. Several witnesses reported that these hermits, if that's what they were, seemed to communicate with wolves that traveled with them. Whether these were actually members of Hartman's expedition or simply wild men driven mad by isolation is impossible to determine now. The records are too fragmentary, and too many documents were deliberately destroyed. The pattern of encounters continued through the middle decades of the 18th century. German explorers pushing into the Ohio Valley reported similar experiences, wolves that behaved with human intelligence and seemed specifically hostile to European encroachment. A Prussian naturalist named Wilhelm Brenner documented 3 separate incidents in 1742 where his expedition encountered wolves that walked upright for extended periods and appeared to be observing and following them deliberately. Brenner's detailed sketches of these creatures show animals that are anatomically impossible, with limb proportions that shift between wolf and human, depending on their posture. What distinguishes Brenner's account from earlier ones is his attempt to capture one of the creatures. After weeks of being followed by a pack of 7 wolves, Brenner became convinced that studying one of these animals was essential to understanding what they truly were. He constructed elaborate traps and set them along routes he knew the wolves were traveling. The first 3 traps were systematically destroyed, disassembled with what Brenner described as deliberate care, as though the wolves were demonstrating that they understood how the mechanisms worked. The 4th trap succeeded in catching one of the smaller animals. What happened next would haunt Brenner for the rest of his life. The captured wolf didn't struggle or try to escape. Instead, it sat calmly in the trap and watched the expedition members approach. Brenner described its eyes as disturbingly aware, tracking each person individually and seeming to assess them. When he moved closer with the intention of securing the animal for transport, it spoke. The sound that came from the wolf's throat wasn't a growl or a whine, but a single word in German, spoken clearly enough that all 6 members of the expedition heard it. The word was mistake. The other wolves attacked 30 seconds later, not with the wild ferocity of animals, but with calculated precision. They disabled 2 expedition members with injuries to their legs, deliberate wounds that prevented the men from walking but weren't life-threatening. They destroyed the trap, holding their companion without touching the trapped wolf itself, and then they left, taking the freed animal with them. The entire attack lasted less than a minute, and the coordination required to execute it spoke to planning and communication that no pack of normal wolves could possess. Brenner and his expedition retreated immediately. The 2 injured men survived, but walked with permanent limps. The expedition never returned to that region, and Brenner spent his later years trying to convince academic societies in Europe to take his reports seriously. They never did. His detailed journals were filed away as the eccentric writings of a man who had spent too long in the wilderness, and his sketches of the creatures were dismissed as fantasy. But copies of those journals survived, and they found their way into the hands of other German naturalists who were planning their own expeditions to the New World. By the 1750s, enough reports had accumulated that certain regions of colonial America were being actively avoided by German settlers. Maps from this period show blank spaces labeled with warnings in German, areas described as unsuitable for settlement, not because of terrain or native tribes, but because of undefined dangers. Modern historians who have examined these maps often assume the warnings refer to indigenous resistance or difficult geography, but the original notations are more specific. They reference creatures that hunt men who hunt them, animals that should not be able to reason but do. The encounters weren't limited to wilderness regions. Several German communities established in supposedly safe areas reported problems with wolves that seemed to be conducting surveillance of the settlements. These wolves would appear at the edges of villages at dusk, studying the buildings and watching the people with an intensity that felt personal rather than instinctual. They never attacked livestock or threatened children, but their presence created an atmosphere of dread that some communities couldn't tolerate. Entire settlements packed up and moved to new locations, specifically to escape what they described as the watching wolves. Johann Weiss, a schoolteacher in a Pennsylvania German community, kept detailed records of wolf sightings near his village over a 5-year period, starting in 1753. His observations reveal patterns that shouldn't exist in normal wolf behavior. The same individual wolves, identifiable by distinct markings, appeared repeatedly over years, far longer than the typical lifespan of a wild wolf. These wolves showed no interest in the village's livestock, but seemed obsessed with observing human activities. Weiss documented occasions when the wolves appeared to be counting, sitting at the forest edge and clearly directing their attention to each person who passed, as though tracking who lived in the village and who was merely visiting. The strangest part of Weiss's records are his notes on what happened when villagers died. Within days of a death, the wolves would gather near the cemetery in unusual numbers. They made no aggressive moves and didn't disturb the graves, but they maintained a presence throughout the burial and for several days afterward. Weiss wrote that this behavior reminded him of human mourners, as though the wolves were paying respects or witnessing the ritual. When he mentioned this observation to village elders, they quietly told him that such things had been noticed before, but weren't discussed openly. Speaking about the wolves attracted their attention, the elders claimed, and attention from these particular animals was something best avoided. What the elders knew but didn't tell Weiss was that the village had been established on the site of an earlier settlement that had been abandoned suddenly in 1729. Records from that earlier community were sparse, but the few surviving documents mentioned wolves that walked like men and spoke with human voices. The decision to rebuild on the same site had been controversial, but land was scarce, and the location offered advantages that seemed worth the risk. Whether that calculation proved correct depends on how you interpret what happened to the village over the following decades. The watching wolves never left. Children born in the village grew up knowing not to make eye contact with the animals at the forest edge. Women learned to time their trips to the well for midday when the wolves were less active. Men organized their farming schedules to ensure no one worked the fields alone. These adaptations became so ingrained in daily life that younger generations didn't question them. This was simply how you lived when your village existed under constant observation. But in 1759, something changed. The wolves began entering the village itself, not attacking, not even threatening, just walking through the streets in broad daylight as though claiming ownership. The first time it happened, 3 large wolves strolled down the main road at noon, moving with the casual confidence of residents rather than intruders. They paused outside the church, and witnesses swore the largest of the 3 looked up at the steeple for a long moment before continuing through the village and back into the forest. Weiss recorded the incident but struggled to describe the unsettling nature of the encounter. These weren't animals raiding for food or acting on instinct. They were making a statement. The incidents escalated over the next several weeks. Wolves appeared inside the village with increasing frequency, always during daylight, always moving with purpose. They were never aggressive, which somehow made their presence more disturbing than an attack would have been. People began finding wolf tracks on their doorsteps in the morning, perfect prints pressed into the dirt, as though the animals had stood there for extended periods during the night, just waiting and listening. One family discovered tracks that led up to their window, and when they examined the marks, they realized a wolf must have stood on its hind legs to look inside. The window was 6 feet off the ground. Weiss documented a particularly unsettling incident involving a young girl named Anna Keller. She had been playing near her family's home when a massive gray wolf approached her. Unlike the adults who had learned fear of these creatures, Anna showed no alarm. She spoke to the wolf as she might to a neighbor's dog, asking it questions in her innocent way. The wolf sat down in front of her and, according to multiple witnesses who watched from nearby windows, appeared to be listening. When Anna's mother finally found the courage to rush out and pull her daughter inside, the wolf didn't leave. It remained sitting in the same spot for another hour, facing the house, before finally walking away, with what several people described as a disturbingly human gait. The village council met in secret to discuss what could be done. Some members argued for organizing hunting parties to eliminate the wolves. Others, remembering what had happened to settlements that had tried to fight these creatures, advocated for abandoning the village entirely. A third faction suggested something that shocked the more religious members of the council. They proposed attempting to communicate with the wolves, to negotiate some kind of understanding. The idea that animals, even naturally intelligent ones, could be reasoned with seemed absurd to most. But desperate times invited desperate considerations. Before the council could decide on any course of action, the wolves made their own decision. One morning, the villagers woke to find every house surrounded by tracks. Not random prints from animals passing through, but deliberate circles around each building, as though the wolves had mapped the entire settlement during the night. In the center of the village square, they found something that turned confusion into genuine fear. Someone, or something, had arranged stones in a pattern that resembled the layout of the village itself. Each building was represented by a carefully placed rock, and near each rock was a smaller stone. The villagers stood in silence, trying to understand what they were seeing. Were the smaller stones meant to represent people? Was this a threat? A warning? Or was it something else entirely, some kind of declaration? That these creatures knew exactly who lived where. Father Ernst Kohler, the village priest, later wrote in his personal correspondence that he believed they were witnessing something unprecedented in Christian history. These weren't demons or devils as described in Scripture. They weren't possessed animals or manifestations of evil spirits. They were something that existed in a space between the natural and supernatural. Creatures that possessed reason and will, but remained fundamentally inhuman. He struggled with the theological implications. If these beings could think and plan, did they have souls? Could they sin? Were they subject to divine law? The questions tormented him, but what troubled him more was the growing suspicion that these creatures weren't asking for his understanding. They didn't care what humans believed about them. The village of Weisdorf, as it was called, never officially fell to the wolves. There was no attack, no massacre, no dramatic end. Instead, families began leaving one by one, quietly packing their belongings and relocating to other communities. They told neighbors they were moving for economic opportunities or to be closer to relatives, but everyone understood the real reason. The wolves had won simply by being present, by creating an atmosphere of dread so pervasive that normal life became impossible. By 1762, fewer than 20 people remained in Weisdorf. By 1765, it was completely abandoned. The wolves never harmed a single person. Today, the site where Weisdorf once stood is unmarked forest. Local historians in Pennsylvania know the name, but have few details about why the settlement failed. The official records attribute its abandonment to soil exhaustion and better opportunities elsewhere. Johann Weiss's detailed journals weren't discovered until the 1930s, found in a trunk in the attic of his great-great-grandson's house. When researchers began reading his accounts of the watching wolves and the village's slow collapse under their psychological pressure, they initially assumed they were reading some kind of Gothic fiction Weiss had written for entertainment. It wasn't until they cross-referenced his observations with other German colonial documents that patterns began to emerge, patterns that suggested Weiss had been recording something real, something that multiple communities had experienced, but few had documented so thoroughly. The question that haunts researchers who study these accounts is simple but profound. What were these creatures? The descriptions are too consistent across too many independent sources to dismiss as folklore or mass hysteria. German explorers and settlers, separated by years and hundreds of miles, described essentially the same phenomenon. Wolves that walked upright, wolves that spoke German words, wolves that planned and coordinated their actions with human-level intelligence, wolves that seemed to understand property boundaries and social structures. Were they truly werewolves in the traditional sense, humans who could transform into wolves? Or were they something else entirely, a species that occupied a space between human and animal that our categories still can't properly define? Some researchers have suggested these creatures might have been indigenous to the Americas, predating European arrival, but reacting specifically to German encroachment for reasons we may never understand. Others have proposed that European colonization brought with it more than just people and diseases, that perhaps the werewolf legends of Germany weren't entirely legend, and that some of those who fled to the New World carried with them a curse that manifested in the American wilderness. Both theories raise more questions than they answer, but they at least attempt to grapple with evidence that shouldn't exist, according to our understanding of natural history. What remains undeniable is that German exploration and settlement patterns in colonial America were influenced by encounters with something that terrified experienced frontiersmen and naturalists. Men who had faced human enemies, dangerous wildlife, and the hardships of wilderness survival wrote about these wolves with a particular quality of dread that suggests genuine trauma. Their reports weren't sensationalized stories told for entertainment. They were warnings passed quietly among German communities, marking certain territories as places to avoid, regardless of their apparent resources or strategic value. And those warnings were heeded. The maps don't lie. There are regions that should have been settled based on every practical consideration, but remained empty for generations because of accounts like those left by Hans Müller, Jacob Hartmann, Wilhelm Brenner, and Johann Weiss. The warnings worked for a time, but warnings have a way of fading from memory when new generations arrive who never experienced the original threat. By the 1780s, young German settlers who had been born in America began questioning whether the old stories were true or simply cautionary tales meant to keep people from wandering too far from established communities. These younger Germans had grown up hearing English neighbors mock the werewolf legends as old world superstition that had no place in the rational new republic being built. Some of them started to believe their English neighbors might be right. Matthias Schreiber was 24 years old in 1787 when he organized an expedition to survey land in Western Virginia that his grandfather had specifically warned him never to enter. The old man had been part of an earlier exploration party that had encountered what he would only describe as wolves that weren't wolves, and he had sworn never to return to that region. But Matthias dismissed the warning as the fearful ramblings of an elderly man whose mind was failing. The land in question was fertile, well-watered, and unclaimed. In Matthias's view, his grandfather's generation had allowed superstition to cost them valuable opportunities. Matthias led a group of 6 other young German men into the Virginia backcountry in early spring. His journal from the expedition, discovered in the Virginia Historical Society archives in 1978, chronicles the last documented encounter between German explorers and the creatures that had haunted their predecessors. The journal entries begin with confident observations about terrain and resources. Matthias wrote enthusiastically about finding a valley that would support dozens of farms, with clear streams and stands of valuable timber. For the first 2 weeks, the expedition proceeded exactly as planned. The tone of the journal changes abruptly on day 16. Matthias noted that they had begun seeing wolves, which wasn't unusual. But these wolves behaved strangely. They followed the expedition at a fixed distance and seemed to be observing rather than hunting. One of Matthias's companions, a man named Georg Klein, mentioned that his grandfather had told similar stories, but the others laughed it off. Matthias wrote that they were educated men living in an age of reason, and they wouldn't be frightened by animals simply because those animals showed intelligence. He would later recognize that statement as the moment they sealed their fate. Over the next week, the wolves became more bold. They entered the expedition's camps at night, not to steal food, but apparently to investigate the men themselves. Matthias woke one night to find a large gray wolf sitting 3 feet from his bedroll, watching him with what he described as an expression of curiosity rather than aggression. When he sat up, the wolf didn't flee. It tilted its head, studied him for a moment longer, then walked calmly out of the camp. The encounter left Matthias deeply unsettled, though he tried to rationalize it in his journal as unusual but not supernatural behavior. The wolves began leaving signs, just as they had for earlier expeditions, arrangements of stones, broken branches forming patterns, and then came the tracks that showed transformation from 4 legs to 2. Matthias sketched these prints in his journal, and his drawings are virtually identical to those made by Hans Müller 64 years earlier. The repetition of this specific detail across decades and different locations is what makes these accounts so difficult to dismiss. Either multiple German explorers independently invented the same elaborate hoax, or they were all encountering the same phenomenon. On day 27, the expedition made camp near a creek in a narrow valley. Matthias noted in his journal that the location felt wrong somehow, though he couldn't articulate why. The wolves, which had been present every day for nearly 2 weeks, had vanished completely. The forest around them was silent in a way that seemed unnatural. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving through the trees. Georg Klein argued that they should leave the valley immediately, that his grandfather's warnings now made terrible sense. The others agreed, but Matthias insisted they stay one more night. The valley offered everything they had been searching for, and he wasn't willing to abandon it because of nerves and old stories. That decision cost 3 men their lives, though what actually killed them remains unclear, even from Matthias's own account. He wrote that screams woke him sometime after midnight, though he couldn't determine whose voices he was hearing. The campfire had burned down to embers, and in the dim red glow, he saw shapes moving through the camp. Wolves, but wolves that moved wrong, that shifted between 4 legs and 2 legs as they circled the men. He scrambled for his musket, but before he could fire, something struck him across the back of the head with enough force to knock him unconscious. Matthias woke at dawn to find carnage. 3 of his companions were dead, their bodies savaged in ways that didn't match any animal attack Matthias had ever seen. The wounds were deep and precise, inflicted with what seemed like deliberate cruelty rather than the efficient killing of a predator securing food. More disturbing was that the bodies had been arranged in a triangle formation, with each man's head pointing toward the center. Someone or something had moved the corpses after death. The 3 surviving expedition members, including Matthias and Georg, gathered what supplies they could and fled the valley. The wolves followed but didn't attack. They maintained a presence at the edge of visibility, and occasionally Matthias would catch glimpses of them standing upright on their hind legs, watching the fleeing men with what looked like satisfaction. The expedition made it back to civilization after a week of hard travel, and Matthias immediately reported what had happened to local authorities. The official investigation concluded that the men had been killed by a bear, despite Matthias's insistence that no bear could have caused those particular wounds or arranged the bodies that way. When he mentioned the wolves that walked like men, the investigators exchanged knowing glances and suggested that the trauma of the attack had confused his memories. His own community, German settlers who should have understood, treated him with pity rather than belief. The old stories had faded too much. A new generation had decided that such things couldn't be real, which meant anyone claiming to have experienced them must be mistaken or mad. Matthias Schreiber never led another expedition. He spent the rest of his life working his father's farm and rarely speaking about what happened in that Virginia valley. His journal was found among his possessions after his death, sealed in a wooden box with a note written in shaking handwriting. The note read simply, "They are real. They have always been real. Stay away from the places marked in the old maps." But by the time that note was written, there were no old maps left to consult. The warnings had been forgotten, and the blank spaces on German colonial charts had been filled in by later cartographers who didn't know why those spaces had been left empty in the first place. The encounters didn't end with Matthias Schreiber, though they became less frequent and less well documented as the 19th century progressed. Occasional reports surfaced from German communities in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas. Wolves that behaved with human intelligence, attacks that seemed motivated by revenge rather than hunger, disappearances in regions that older settlers still quietly avoided. But these accounts were increasingly dismissed as folklore, stories that had outlived their cultural context and now persisted only as entertaining campfire tales. What no one realized until much later was that the creatures themselves had changed their behavior. Whether through learning or instinct, they had adapted to a world where humans no longer believed in them. They had learned to be more careful, more subtle. Instead of confronting expeditions directly, they used methods that left no clear evidence of their involvement. Hunters who wandered into wrong territories simply didn't return, their disappearances attributed to natural hazards or human violence. Settlements built in certain areas failed for reasons that seemed mundane, bad water or poor soil or economic factors, even though the real cause was a pervasive sense of wrongness that drove people away, without them quite understanding why. Modern researchers who have studied these historical accounts often focus on trying to identify what species of animal might have been misidentified as werewolves. Large wolves certainly existed in colonial America, and black bears standing upright can resemble humanoid figures in poor lighting. But these explanations fall apart when confronted with the specific details repeated across multiple independent sources, the tracks that showed transformation, the use of tools, and the creation of patterns with stones and branches, the apparent understanding of human language, the coordinated pack tactics that required complex communication. No known animal exhibits all of these behaviors, and suggesting that dozens of trained observers across a century all misidentified normal wildlife in exactly the same ways strains credibility. Another theory proposes that German settlers were encountering indigenous peoples of the region and, either through cultural misunderstanding or deliberate deception, interpreted these encounters through the lens of their werewolf folklore. This explanation has some appeal, as it would account for the intelligence and planning evident in the creature's behavior. However, it fails to address the physical descriptions of transformation or the specific anatomical details that witnesses recorded. Moreover, indigenous peoples of the regions where these encounters occurred had their own separate traditions about shapeshifters and were as wary of certain territories as the German settlers became. Perhaps the most intriguing theory comes from cryptozoologists who suggest that North America was once home to an unknown species of large canid that went extinct sometime in the 19th century, possibly driven to extinction by the same westward expansion that decimated wolf and bear populations. This hypothetical animal would have possessed unusual intelligence and possibly even the ability to manipulate its posture to move bipedally for short distances, behaviors that exist in various forms in other species. The problem with this theory is the complete absence of physical remains. No bones have been found, no pelts preserved, nothing but the written accounts and a handful of sketches that show creatures anatomically impossible according to our current understanding of mammalian skeletal structure. The truth is that we may never know what German explorers encountered in the American wilderness. The evidence exists only in documents that most historians dismiss as folklore. And the creatures themselves, if they ever truly existed, left no trace beyond the terror they inspired and the settlements they emptied. What we can say with certainty is that something happened in those forests, something that affected German colonial settlement patterns in measurable ways and left a legacy of stories too consistent and too detailed to be entirely invented. There is one final account worth mentioning, though it comes from the 20th century rather than the colonial period. In 1936, a folklorist named Ernst Bauer was conducting research in rural Pennsylvania, collecting stories from elderly German Americans about their ancestors' experiences. One woman, who would only agree to speak with him if he promised never to use her real name, told him about her great-grandfather's journal, which the family had kept secret for generations. According to her, the journal described an encounter with wolf people in the 1790s, but it also contained something else. A map. The map, she claimed, showed specific locations where her great-grandfather believed the creatures had their dens or territories. These weren't random wilderness areas, but carefully chosen places that shared certain geographical features. They were always in valleys with limited access, always near sources of fresh water, always in regions where the terrain created natural acoustic properties that would carry sound in unusual ways. Her great-grandfather theorized that the creatures chose these locations deliberately, using the land itself as a tool to enhance their ability to monitor and control their territories. Bauer asked to see the journal and the map, but the woman refused. She said her family had debated for years whether to destroy the documents or preserve them, and they had ultimately decided to keep them hidden but intact. She would only say that the map showed locations in Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland, and that some of those locations were now covered by towns and cities. She added one more detail that Bauer found particularly chilling. According to the journal, her great-grandfather had returned to one of the mapped locations in his old age, driven by a need to know if the creatures still existed. He found the valley exactly as he remembered it, still wild and untouched despite encroaching civilization all around it. And in the soft mud near the creek, he found fresh tracks that started as wolf prints and became human footprints before changing back to wolf again. Whether that story is true or simply another layer of folklore added to an already mysterious legacy, we can't determine. Ernst Bauer's notes from his interview with the unnamed woman are preserved in the archives of the Pennsylvania German Society, but he never found the journal or the map. The woman died in 1943, and if her family still possesses those documents, they've never made them public. But the story raises an unsettling possibility. What if the creatures didn't go extinct? What if they simply became better at hiding, adapting to human expansion the same way wolves and bears learn to avoid populated areas? What if they're still out there in the remaining wilderness, watching and waiting in valleys that people instinctively avoid without quite knowing why? That question brings us to our next mystery, one that emerged not in the colonial wilderness, but in the suburban sprawl of post-war America. In a place where werewolves should have been the last thing anyone worried about, the creature that terrorized the town of Loveland, Ohio, starting in 1955, had nothing to do with German folklore or colonial encounters, but it raised the same fundamental question. What happens when something that shouldn't exist decides to make itself known? The Loveland Frogman, as it came to be called, was first reported on a humid May evening in 1955 by a businessman driving home along a rural road that ran parallel to the Little Miami River. The man, whose name was never officially released but who gave a detailed statement to police, claimed he saw 3 figures standing upright on the side of the road. At first, he assumed they were people, perhaps teenagers causing trouble or someone whose car had broken down. He slowed his vehicle, intending to offer assistance. That's when he realized the figures weren't human. They stood approximately 4 feet tall, he reported, with leathery skin that appeared gray-green in his headlights. Their heads were described as frog-like, with wide mouths and large eyes that reflected light with an unnatural quality. But what disturbed him most was that they were clearly bipedal. standing upright with a posture that seemed intentional rather than the hunched stance of an animal that occasionally reared up on its hind legs. One of them was holding something in what the witness described as hands rather than front legs, an object that he couldn't identify, but that seemed to be giving off sparks or some kind of light. The businessman sat frozen in his car, engine running, staring at the three creatures as they stared back at him. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though he later said it felt much longer. Then one of the creatures raised what might have been a hand or a foreleg, and a brilliant burst of light emanated from the object it was holding. The businessman panicked, stepped on the gas, and sped away without looking back. He drove straight to the Loveland police station and filed a report, despite his obvious awareness that doing so would subject him to ridicule. The police took the report more seriously than might be expected, partially because the witness was a respected member of the community with no history of making false claims or seeking attention. They dispatched officers to the location he had indicated, but by the time they arrived, nothing remained except some disturbed vegetation and what might have been tracks in the soft shoulder of the road. The tracks were photographed and measured, but the images were later lost in a file reorganization, leaving only written descriptions. Officers noted that the prints appeared to show four-toed impressions with webbing, consistent with some kind of amphibian, but much larger than any frog native to Ohio. The incident might have remained a single strange report, if not for what happened over the next 2 decades. The Loveland Frogman, or something matching its description, was seen repeatedly by multiple witnesses with no connection to each other. In 1957, a family picnicking near the river reported seeing a group of creatures swimming in a coordinated pattern that seemed too organized to be normal animal behavior. In 1963, a farmer found several of his cattle dead in a field bordering the Little Miami River, killed by something that had torn out their throats with precision and force that he didn't recognize from any predator he knew. The local veterinarian who examined the carcasses could offer no explanation for the nature of the wounds. But the incident that brought the Loveland Frogman to national attention occurred in March of 1972, when 2 separate police officers encountered the creature within 2 weeks of each other. Officer Ray Shockey was driving his patrol car along Riverside Drive around 1 in the morning when something darted across the road in front of his vehicle. He slammed on his brakes and watched as the figure, which he later described as a large, upright, frog-like creature, paused at the guardrail and looked back at him. Officer Shockey reported that the creature was illuminated by his headlights for several seconds, giving him a clear view. It had leathery skin, stood on 2 legs with a slight crouch, and possessed what looked like hands at the end of its front limbs. Then it leaped over the guardrail and disappeared toward the river with a movement that Shockey said covered at least 15 feet in a single bound. 2 weeks later, Officer Mark Matthews encountered what he believed was the same creature in almost the exact same location. Matthews's report corroborated Shockey's description in nearly every detail, adding only that he had attempted to shoot the creature, but missed. He followed it to the river's edge and watched it enter the water and swim away with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for something that large, moving on land just moments before. The dual police sightings created a media sensation. Reporters descended on Loveland, and the Frogman became a fixture in local and national news for several months. The attention had predictable results. Some people embraced the story as proof that unknown creatures shared our world. Others dismissed it as mass hysteria or misidentification, and Officer Matthews, perhaps weary of the attention or pressure from skeptics, later recanted his story, claiming he had simply seen an iguana that someone had released into the wild and that his imagination had done the rest. The recantation was widely reported and generally accepted as the end of the Loveland Frogman mystery. Just another case of misidentification amplified by local legend and media sensationalism. Except Officer Matthews's revised story didn't account for several problematic details. Iguanas, even large ones, don't move with the bipedal gait both officers described. They don't leap 15 feet in a single bound, and they certainly don't survive Ohio winters, which would have killed any released exotic pet long before March. Moreover, Matthews's recantation made no mention of Officer Shockey's sighting 2 weeks earlier, and Shockey never recanted his report. He maintained until his death in 2015 that he saw exactly what he described, a large amphibian-like creature that walked upright like a man. What's often left out of the Loveland Frogman story is what local residents knew but rarely discussed publicly. The sightings didn't stop in 1972. They simply stopped being reported to police or media. People who lived along the Little Miami River continued to see strange things at night, figures moving along the riverbank that didn't match any animal they recognized. Some heard vocalizations from the water that sounded like a cross between a bullfrog's croak and something disturbingly close to human speech. A few claimed to find tracks in the mud that showed clear toe separation and webbing, but were far too large to belong to any amphibian that should exist in Ohio. Researcher and cryptozoologist Ron Schaffner spent years investigating the Loveland Frogman, interviewing witnesses and collecting reports that never made it into official channels. He documented dozens of additional sightings from the 1970s through the early 2000s, creating a timeline that showed the encounters followed a pattern. Activity increased during spring and early summer, corresponding with breeding season for amphibians. Sightings clustered around specific stretches of the Little Miami River, where the water ran deep and slow, and witnesses consistently described the same basic creature. Variations in detail, but agreement on the fundamental characteristics: bipedal locomotion, frog-like features, intelligence that seemed too advanced for a simple animal. Schaffner developed a theory that the Loveland Frogman might be a surviving population of an unknown species of giant salamander, or a primitive amphibian that had evolved in isolated water systems and occasionally surfaced when humans encroached on their habitat. He pointed to the existence of the Chinese giant salamander and the Japanese giant salamander, both of which can grow to nearly 6 feet in length and possess rudimentary limbs that allow limited terrestrial movement. Perhaps, he suggested, North America had its own giant salamander species that had gone undocumented because it was primarily nocturnal and aquatic, rarely venturing onto land except during specific seasonal behaviors. The theory had some merit. The Little Miami River system includes numerous caves and underground waterways that could theoretically harbor a population of large amphibians without regular human contact. The creature's apparent intelligence could be explained by comparing them to octopuses, which demonstrate problem-solving abilities despite being invertebrates. Their bipedal movement, while unusual, wasn't impossible for an amphibian with the right skeletal structure. Schaffner's theory attempted to place the Loveland Frogman within the bounds of zoological possibility to suggest that this was a real animal that simply hadn't been properly studied, rather than something supernatural or otherworldly. But the theory struggled to account for certain aspects of the encounters. The object producing light in the original 1955 sighting suggested tool use, a level of sophistication that no known amphibian possesses. The coordinated swimming patterns witnessed in 1957 implied complex social behavior and communication, and the precision of the cattle killings in 1963 spoke to hunting strategies more advanced than any amphibian had ever demonstrated. These details pushed the Loveland Frogman beyond the category of unknown species and into the realm of something that challenged our understanding of what animals could B. The last widely reported sighting occurred in 2016, though this one came with a twist. A woman walking her dog along the Little Miami Scenic Trail at dusk claimed to see a frog-like creature standing upright in shallow water. She managed to take a photograph with her phone before the creature retreated into deeper water and disappeared. The photo was blurry and taken from a distance, but it appeared to show something bipedal with an unusual silhouette. Skeptics immediately identified it as a person in a costume or a misidentified mundane object. Believers saw it as proof that the frogman was still active in the Loveland area. The photo analysis couldn't determine anything conclusive. Digital forensics showed no signs of manipulation, but the image quality was too poor to identify specific anatomical features. The woman who took the photo declined media interviews, saying she simply wanted to document what she saw and didn't care whether anyone believed her. Her lack of interest in fame or attention actually gave her account more credibility among serious researchers. People seeking attention usually seek attention. Today, Loveland has embraced its frogman legend in the way small towns often embrace local mysteries. There are frogman statues, frogman-themed businesses, and an annual Loveland Frogman 5K race. The creature has become a mascot, a quirky piece of local identity that attracts tourists and provides material for children's books and community events. The commercialization has had the effect of making the original encounters seem less credible, as though the whole thing was always just harmless fun, rather than something that genuinely frightened witnesses and baffled investigators. But talk to the older residents who remember the original sightings, and you'll find that many of them still take the frogman seriously. They remember when the police took it seriously, before the recantation and the media circus. They remember family members who saw things along the river that they couldn't explain. And they remember the nights when people stopped going near the Little Miami after dark, when parents kept their children inside, not because of human threats, but because of something else, something that lived in the water and sometimes came onto land for reasons no one understood. The Loveland frogman might be an unknown species, a case of repeated misidentification, or an elaborate hoax that fooled multiple credible witnesses across 6 decades. Whatever the truth, the story serves as a reminder that the natural world still holds mysteries, that suburban Ohio is just as capable of producing the unexplained as the deepest wilderness, and that sometimes the most unsettling monsters are the ones that appear in familiar places, forcing us to question what we think we know about the world we live in. The German explorers who encountered werewolves in colonial forests and the Ohio police officers who faced the Loveland frogman share something beyond simply having strange stories to tell. They share the experience of confronting something that their training and understanding told them couldn't exist, and then having to live with the knowledge that it did. Whether these creatures were flesh and blood animals from unknown species, visitors from somewhere else, or something that exists in the spaces between what we consider possible and impossible, they left the marks on the people who encountered them. Marks that don't fade, just because the world has decided such things aren't real. The forests of Pennsylvania still have valleys that feel wrong to enter. The Little Miami River still has stretches where people feel watched from the water. And somewhere in attics and archives, there are journals and photographs and maps that document encounters with things that shouldn't exist but do. The question isn't whether to believe these accounts. The question is whether we're willing to accept that our understanding of the natural world might still be incomplete, that there might still be discoveries waiting in the shadows, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the old warnings passed down through generations might be worth heeding after all. The watching wolves never really left. They just learned to hide better. And the frogman still swims in the Little Miami River, seen by those who happen to be in the right place at the wrong time. Or perhaps the wrong place at the right time, depending on whether you're the kind of person who wants to know the truth or the kind who's happier not knowing. Either way, the creatures remain, waiting in the forgotten corners of our well-mapped world, reminding us that mystery hasn't been entirely driven out by progress, and that some stories persist because they're more than just stories. They're warnings, records, and evidence of a world stranger than we're usually willing to admit.